Sydney Marlowe hadn't been back to her father's cabin in over 11 years. Not since the snowstorm. Not since that argument. Not since the day she left and promised herself she'd never come back. The cabin had stood all that time in a forgotten valley between two hills in the Wasatch Range, barely marked on any modern map, like a relic of a life that had chosen solitude over society. Her father, Thomas Marlowe, had always been that way, stoic, guarded, and fiercely territorial. He had built the cabin with his own hands after retiring early from the parks department, cutting ties with most of the family, and retreating into the wilderness with a stubborn resolve that matched the stone foundation beneath the house. When he passed away, officially from a fall during a routine hike, though Sydney had always felt the circumstances were too vague, she hadn't rushed to claim what he left behind. The cabin was mentioned in his will, along with a single key and a hand-drawn map she found tucked inside an envelope with no return address. It wasn't until nearly a year later, after her own life had begun to unspool in small, frustrating threads, that she found herself looking at the key again, running her thumb along its worn edges. She was tired of litigation, of being on the front lines of other people's problems. The city, her job as a court liaison, the endless gray hallways of municipal buildings, they had all become exhausting in a way that no sleep could fix. The cabin felt like a puzzle she had postponed too long. And so, with the excuse of clearing up paperwork, she took a week off and drove east, through the changing terrain, past the last gas station, and into the silence her father had once called home. The approach to the property was a familiar one, and yet she felt a creeping sense of unease with every mile. The trees had thickened, the road narrowed, and the cell signal had died long ago. But what made her foot lift off the gas, what made her stomach knot just a little, was the unexpected sight ahead. A new structure, simple and utilitarian. 3 thick metal posts driven into the ground, connected by a coil of rusted barbed wire that stretched across the entry path like a clenched jaw. There was no gate, no lock, just a crude blockade with a metal sign hammered into the earth beside it, its white paint already fading. Zone under review. Entry prohibited until completion of property assessment. Sector 12B. The message was printed in sterile block letters, but the post was clearly hand-installed, slightly crooked as though someone had done it in a hurry or without proper tools. Sydney stepped out of the car slowly, her boots sinking into the softened gravel. She looked at the coil, then at the sign, then down at the soil, where heavy tire tracks veered off to the side and disappeared into the underbrush. A narrow path, half covered in moss and mud, hinted at irregular use. Someone had been here, and recently. Her father's cabin, as far as she knew, was the only structure past this point, yet she hadn't given anyone permission to access it. Nor had she been notified of any changes to the legal status of the land. She pulled the key from her jacket pocket and stared at it for a long moment. Then, tucking it back inside, she turned and made her way on foot around the wire, stepping carefully through the brush and the damp forest floor. She moved quietly, almost instinctively, as if disturbing the silence too much might trigger something she wasn't prepared to face. The forest opened slowly, and with it came the first sight of the cabin. It stood exactly as she remembered, its timber siding darkened by years of weather, the windows fogged and slightly warped from within. The porch steps creaked when she mounted them, and the air smelled of damp pine and decayed leaves. There was no sign of recent entry from this side, no footprints, no pry marks, no forced locks, but something felt different, off. The kind of feeling you get not from what you see, but from what you don't. She slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door opened with a sigh of dust and age. Inside, the furniture was covered in white sheets her father had probably thrown over them out of habit. The wood stove was cold and everything seemed undisturbed except for one thing. A folded paper resting in the center of the table, weighed down by a stone. It was not yellowed like the rest of the paper scattered around. It was new. The handwriting wasn't her father's. 3 words were written across the page. "You're too late." Sydney didn't move at first. She just stared at the words, her body frozen in that space between disbelief and calculation. Then, slowly, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a careful click. She didn't touch the note. Instead, she moved through the space methodically, opening drawers, checking cabinets, peering behind curtains. There were subtle details out of place. A half-used roll of paper towels, a coffee mug that hadn't been washed, and faint muddy footprints near the back entrance, leading in, not out. Someone had been staying here, someone who had access and no intention of asking her permission. She walked out onto the back porch, taking a deep breath of the cool mountain air, and scanned the tree line. She remembered how her father used to say the hills could listen, that if you paid enough attention you could hear when something wasn't right. And something here was deeply, absolutely not right. She returned to her car, took out the original will, the deed to the property, and the county-issued parcel map. Everything matched. Every line, every coordinate. She was the legal owner. The land was hers. But someone had moved in quietly, not to claim the property by force, but to undermine her presence entirely, to erase her before she even arrived. It wasn't just trespassing. It was something else. Something calculated. Back in the car, she made a call to the county office, expecting a standard records clerk to pick up. But the line clicked, and after several redirects, a clipped voice informed her that the land surrounding her father's parcel had recently been reclassified as part of a buffer zone, due to proposed watershed redistricting, and that her parcel was currently under review for transitional reallocation. When she asked who had initiated the review, the clerk hesitated, then said only, "The district committee," before disconnecting the call without explanation. Sydney stared at the phone screen. No names, no offices, no reference numbers, just a vague procedural wall, cold and impenetrable. She looked again at the barbed wire, then at the cabin, then back toward the trees where the faintest glint of glass caught her attention, like the reflection from binoculars. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply watched. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they had made one critical error. They assumed she would scare easily. They were wrong. The following morning, Sydney woke to the creaking chill of the cabin and the low, distant drone of something mechanical. At first, she thought it might be a truck or some kind of forestry equipment, but the sound was too faint, too steady, more like a generator humming far off in the trees. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter against the cold air, and scanned the forest beyond the clearing. There were no vehicles, no smoke, no clear source of the noise, just that rhythmic mechanical pulse, almost like a heartbeat buried in the hills. It faded by the time she walked to the edge of the property, vanishing like a mirage once she crossed a certain invisible threshold. She knelt by the barbed wire again, tracing the pattern of installation. The posts weren't simply hammered in. They had been cemented with quick-dry compound, and faint orange spray paint markers were still visible on the ground, partially covered by fallen leaves. Someone had surveyed this area. Not recently. Very recently. Returning to the cabin, she retrieved her father's old notebook from the office alcove. He had always kept meticulous records, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, tree growth, but in his last entries, there were vague references to encroachments, notated with dates and timestamps, and a single phrase underlined twice in red. Boundary. Pressure is not random. Someone's testing reaction time. Sydney felt a chill settle in her chest. This wasn't paranoia. Her father had been rational to a fault. If he sensed something, it meant there was a real presence pushing toward the land. Back in town, she drove to the county land office, a squat, windowless building that smelled like ink toner and stale coffee. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his late 50s with thick glasses and a comb-over, smiled absently when she approached, clearly expecting a routine question about a lost parcel ID or water rights permit. But when Sydney explained the issue, the barbed wire, the sector signs, the reclassification of the surrounding land, his expression shifted. Not alarmed, not helpful either, but guarded, like someone who had heard similar complaints but had been told not to get involved. He pulled up her parcel on the database, scanned the screen for a long moment, then frowned slightly. "That's odd," he muttered. "Your property still shows up under private freehold, but there's a flag on the adjacent zone. Says it's pending review for integration into a managed green buffer. Looks like part of the watershed initiative." Sydney asked if that included her land. He shook his head slowly, then hesitated. "Not officially, but when the buffer zones expand, sometimes properties get looped in. It's usually voluntary." She pushed the issue. "Voluntary, but I wasn't notified." He looked at her again, this time more cautiously, and leaned slightly over the counter, lowering his voice. "They don't always wait for consent. Technically, until the redistricting passes, no action can be enforced. But it's not uncommon for groups to get ahead of the paperwork, install markers, put up barriers, try to discourage pushback." She asked who they were. He glanced around the empty office, then tapped on the side of his monitor. "There's a local committee that oversees compliance, not directly affiliated with the county, more like a regional partnership initiative. They submit proposed zoning modifications, coordinate with surveyors, and so on." She asked for a contact. He typed something quickly, scribbled a name and number on a sticky note, and handed it over. "You didn't get this from me," he said quietly. The contact led her to a nondescript two-room office in the back of a shopping plaza near the edge of town. There was no name on the door, just a single plaque that read, "Operations Unit, Zone Coordination." Inside, a woman in a charcoal suit with tightly pinned blonde hair and a clipboard greeted Sydney with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Miss Marlowe, we were expecting you." That alone set Sydney's nerves on edge. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't mentioned her visit to anyone beyond the clerk, but the woman, who introduced herself only as Beth, acted as if this were a scheduled appointment. They sat in a sterile meeting room where the walls were bare except for a single laminated map of the valley, marked with red, blue, and yellow boundary lines. Beth explained that Sydney's parcel was of interest, due to its location and proximity to a sensitive environmental corridor. When Sydney countered that her deed showed no such classification, Beth replied smoothly, "That's precisely why it's under review. We're working to reconcile outdated plats with modern ecological priorities." Sydney asked if that justified fencing off land she legally owned. Beth smiled again, thinner this time. "You'll find we're well within our operational scope. The wire is temporary and intended only to prevent disruption during review." Sydney stared at her, measuring her words. Disruption of what? Wildlife? Drainage? Beth didn't answer immediately. She closed her folder instead and said, "There are considerations beyond the immediate. Future planning often precedes current occupancy. We'd be happy to offer you a relocation grant if the process becomes burdensome." It took Sydney a moment to fully register what she had just heard. They were offering to pay her off. Move her out quietly. Remove an obstacle without legal confrontation. She declined, clearly and firmly. Beth nodded as if she had expected it, then handed her a small envelope. Inside was a document labeled Notification of a Cooperative Transfer Request, voluntary acknowledgement of parcel integration, with her name already printed at the top. The envelope also contained a pre-stamped return envelope and a deadline marked in red, response required, within 7 days. Sydney stood up, thanked Beth without sincerity, and left without signing anything. That night, she returned to the cabin and found the front door ajar. She approached cautiously, her hand instinctively resting on the heavy flashlight she had retrieved from the car earlier. The door swung open easily. Nothing inside appeared damaged or stolen, but the feeling had shifted. The air inside was colder. The chair by the fireplace was turned slightly, angled toward the window, as though someone had been sitting there watching the forest. On the kitchen counter, she found a metal thermos that hadn't been there before. The outside was damp with condensation. It was still warm. Whoever had been here had left minutes before she arrived. She closed the door quietly and sat down at the table, placing the unsigned, voluntary transfer paper beside the earlier note. Too late, indeed. She stayed up most of the night, keeping the lights off, watching the tree line. At one point, close to 3 a.m., she saw a brief flicker of movement near the old shed beyond the clearing. Not wildlife. The shape was too upright, too careful. She waited, heart racing, but the figure didn't return. By morning, new stakes had appeared along the edge of her property, yellow this time and unmarked. No explanation, no paperwork, no sign of who had placed them. Just there, like silent claims in the soil. As she knelt to inspect one, she saw that the dirt around it was freshly disturbed, and deep beneath the surface, something metallic reflected in the sunlight. She dug with her hands for a few minutes and uncovered a small steel box, bolted shut with no markings. She took it inside but didn't open it yet. Instinct told her it wasn't meant for her. Whatever was happening here wasn't just administrative redistricting. It wasn't just overreach or encroachment. It was a coordinated effort to push her off the land, quietly and permanently, without ever having to say so out loud. It was displacement masked as zoning, theft dressed in environmental concern, and it had already begun. Sydney returned to the cabin from a brief trip into town with a fresh set of printed property records and a topographic overlay she had managed to purchase from a reluctant cartographer in the back office of a local mapping supply store. The map was from a decade ago, clear, detailed, and, more importantly, consistent with the documents her father had kept in his home file drawer, a drawer that now looked slightly more disturbed than when she last checked it. She had marked out the known coordinates of the cabin, outlined the older tree lines, and matched them to the latest county records. Everything checked out. Her parcel was intact, legally defined, and well within its boundaries, which made what she saw upon arriving even more inexplicable. New posts had been added to the barbed wire fencing, not just reinforcing it, but stretching it across the far end of the access road in a full loop, encircling the cabin like a pen. The wire had doubled in thickness, strung lower to the ground, and interlaced with orange warning tape that flapped silently in the wind, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Triangles inside circles, no words. There was no sign of vehicles or personnel, but someone had clearly worked fast and deliberately, as though installing a security measure around something radioactive. She parked further up the road this time, careful to remain off what she now suspected was being monitored. As she approached the cabin on foot, she noticed new footprints in the mud near the rear shed, heavy-soled boots, larger than hers, pressed deep into the wet earth, looping around to the side window that had been half covered with plastic sheeting from the inside. She entered cautiously, flashlight in hand, even though the daylight was still strong. Inside, the cabin was mostly untouched, but she could smell something faint and chemical, like solvent or adhesive. In the back room, where her father had kept an old tool cabinet, she found the drawers partially open. A few tools were missing, including a pry bar and a rusted handheld auger. More curiously, one of the floorboards beneath the cabinet had been recently unscrewed and reattached, the screws mismatched and newer than the surrounding ones. Sydney grabbed a screwdriver and removed the board. The cavity beneath it was empty. Whatever had once been stored there, if anything, was gone. She stared into the darkness below, trying to determine what had changed. Then she realized there was no dust, not even a fine layer. The space had been wiped clean. Someone had come here with intent, not random vandalism. Someone looking for something they believed her father had hidden. Frustrated and now increasingly concerned for her safety, she called the number on the zone coordination document. No answer. She then tried the county assessor's office again, explaining more urgently that unknown individuals had installed a perimeter barrier around her property without a warrant or legal cause. This time, she was transferred to a compliance manager who spoke with the syrupy calm of someone well-practiced in obfuscation. "Ma'am, the county's role is advisory in these cooperative zoning agreements. If you have a conflict with a regional compliance partner, I suggest retaining counsel." Sydney asked, plainly and with restrained anger, if the county could at least confirm whether her land had been seized or encumbered. The manager replied, "According to our records, your property is still under your name. However, there are pending annotations tied to the watershed reclassification. It's a fluid situation, best handled through mediation." The word annotations sent a chill down her spine. That meant her property was being digitally altered on maps, without her consent, in ways that wouldn't show up on printed documents, just like what she had suspected when she saw the parcel ID change in the internal database. She hung up and immediately contacted a licensed surveyor from a nearby city, someone outside the influence of the local circle. The woman, a hard-nosed expert named Eliza Dre, agreed to come up the next day with full equipment and digital records. In the meantime, Sydney locked every door and window and began taking detailed photographs of everything: fence lines, posts, markings, boot prints, the odd box she had retrieved from the soil, which she still had not opened. The following morning, Eliza arrived with a drone, 2 GPS receivers, and a compressed laptop workstation. She didn't waste time with small talk. After Sydney walked her through the situation, she nodded, pulled out her gear, and went to work. The survey took 4 hours. Eliza's face remained impassive the whole time, but by the end, she motioned Sydney over and pointed to her screen. "You're not just in bounds," she said. "You're deep within your rights. Whoever put that wire up is intentionally intruding." She rotated the map and pointed to a shaded red zone blinking at the far corner. "That sector? It doesn't exist, not on any state records, but it shows up as a restricted buffer on a private zoning overlay I got from a leaked consultant database 2 months ago. You're in the middle of a ghost project. My guess? Water rights? Your land sits on one of the last unrestricted water tables in the valley. Someone wants it quiet, someone with access to unofficial maps." Before Sydney could respond, a vehicle pulled into view at the edge of the trail. A black SUV, unmarked, rolled to a stop 20 yards from them. The windows were tinted. 3 people stepped out. 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing charcoal gray jackets with the same unidentifiable logo stitched on the chest, the triangle inside circle symbol. One of the men walked forward, his posture formal, his expression unreadable. "Ladies," he said, "this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to cease all unauthorized mapping activities." Eliza stood her ground. "We're on private property. This is a contracted legal survey. Any interference constitutes obstruction." The man didn't flinch. He produced a small black case and opened it, revealing a folded document printed on heavy paper. "This is a notification of preliminary injunction under Article 6A of the Regional Watershed Directive. This property is subject to pending transitional oversight." Sydney took the paper and examined it. No court stamp. No official seal. No named judge. Just a letterhead from the Regional Environmental Tasking Initiative and a set of vague references to proposed zoning law that had not yet passed legislation. It was theater, designed to intimidate. "This isn't enforceable," she said. "Not without court authorization." The man's face remained still. "We'll be filing an injunction for trespass against your surveyor. Any further activity may result in legal action." He turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. As they drove off, Sydney noticed a camera mounted under the front bumper, aimed at the cabin. Later that afternoon, as Eliza packed up, she said, "Whatever you're caught in, it's bigger than a land grab. There's funding behind this. They're using environmental law to manufacture jurisdiction, and they don't expect you to fight back. Sydney nodded slowly. Then they're in for a surprise. As she spoke, she looked at the metal box again, still unopened on her desk. Her father had hidden it. Someone had buried it. The stakes had been driven around it. It wasn't part of the land. It was the reason for all of this. She opened the latches and lifted the lid. Inside was a dense bundle of laminated documents bundled with tape. She peeled it away slowly. The top page read, Preliminary Water Table Mapping, U.S. Resource Commission, Confidential Review Copy. Below that were diagrams, borehole test data, and coordinates. Lots of them. Deep aquifer locations, reservoir models, and handwritten notes. Do not submit. Private stakeholders manipulating public reports. At the very bottom was a single sheet with 3 names. One was the name of the man from the SUV, Michael Latham. Another was her father's. And the third, in red ink, Control via zoning is a smokescreen. Objective is water. Sydney sat back in the chair, the weight of it all crashing over her. This wasn't just pressure, this was a campaign. And her land wasn't just in the way, it was the target. Sydney spent the next morning cross-referencing every document from the metal box against her father's old logs and the survey data Eliza had gathered. The evidence was damning in its simplicity. A clear contradiction between publicly available zoning maps and the suppressed, highly detailed water resource studies hidden in that steel container. Her father hadn't been speculating. He had known exactly what was happening. The maps dated back over 15 years and referenced exploratory drilling in the area marked by an obscure subcontractor that no longer existed, its parent entity absorbed and renamed multiple times in what was clearly a corporate shell game. The more Sydney traced, the more she saw the threads pull toward a common goal: privatization of the region's natural water access through bureaucratic suffocation and voluntary surrender by landowners under the guise of environmental preservation. Her land, positioned directly above a deep, untapped aquifer, was not just valuable, it was indispensable. And the effort to push her out had not been clumsy or impulsive. It was part of a long, slow constriction, planned with surgical precision and dressed in the harmless language of community development. Eliza had already taken her copy of the findings back to her firm, promising to anonymize the data and begin quiet inquiries with state-level legal contacts, ones far outside the local sphere of influence. Sydney trusted her, but she also knew that once the opposition realized she hadn't taken the bait, hadn't folded under pressure or signed their so-called voluntary handover, they would escalate. And she was right. By mid-afternoon, a courier left an envelope wedged into her cabin's fence post. No return address. Inside was a letter printed on glossy paper bearing a new organizational name: Valley Initiative for Resource Equity. The tone was friendly, even casual, as if from a neighbor inviting her to a cookout. It stated that her presence on the land was causing unnecessary friction within a sensitive corridor, and that she might consider taking advantage of the incentive program available to legacy property holders, which included a buyout significantly above market value. Sydney almost laughed. It was bold, brazen, and perfectly timed, meant to reach her just before dinner, when she'd be most tired, most vulnerable, and most likely to let her guard slip. She folded the letter neatly, slid it into a drawer, and locked it. That night, the generator-like hum returned, louder this time, pulsing through the hills with a strange resonance. Sydney sat in the dark, her ears tuned to every fluctuation, her eyes fixed on the tree line where that distant glint had appeared before. She didn't sleep. Just after 3 a.m., motion sensors triggered along the ridge, part of a basic system she had installed days earlier using leftover gear from her father's storeroom. The alert was faint, just a blink on a small device clipped to her belt, but it was enough. She rose quietly, armed only with a flashlight and her phone, and slipped outside. The forest was thick with mist. Visibility was low, but when she reached the crest of the southern path, she saw it. Two figures moving near the border stakes, using tools to reposition or perhaps remove one of the markers. They weren't in uniform this time. They wore dark jackets, nondescript. One of them moved with the fluidity of someone trained, not in construction, but in stealth. She stepped on a branch by accident, and both heads turned. There was a moment of pause. No one moved. Then they bolted. She didn't chase them. She wasn't foolish, but she made note of their path, the direction they fled, and the fact that they didn't seem surprised to have been caught. It was almost as if they were testing response time again, just like her father had warned. Back at the cabin, she found that one of the posts near the edge had been pulled halfway out of the soil, then hastily reinserted. But near it, embedded at the base of a tree, was something new. A plastic tag, the kind used in industrial surveys, stamped with a code and the initials VIRE. They had stopped hiding. They were marking the area now like a project already in progress. The next day, Sydney drove to the city office of land compliance to request a formal statement on her parcel's legal standing. She brought all her documents, including the surveyor's digital logs and her father's original deed. The clerk behind the desk processed her request silently, then printed out a sheet with a dry efficiency that didn't match the importance of what it said. Her parcel was flagged. Not seized, not under active litigation, but marked for anticipated jurisdictional realignment. A phrase that meant nothing and everything. She asked who had entered the flag. The clerk blinked at her, then admitted she couldn't see that information. "That section is internal," she said. "Only staff with clearance from the Regional Zoning Task Force can access origin data." Sydney left the office with a tightness in her chest that hadn't been there before. Not fear. Not exactly. It was anger. Righteous, clear anger. This wasn't some slow-moving bureaucratic snowball anymore. This was a machine. Well-funded, coordinated, and willing to bypass legal norms to seize what they wanted. And she was no longer just resisting paperwork. She was resisting an entity willing to operate in the dark, behind shell names, with personnel who showed up at night and used legal language like a scalpel. That realization brought her to a decision. She wasn't going to escalate through confrontation, but through exposure. She made contact with Eliza again, this time requesting introductions to state-level archivists and regulatory analysts, people who understood how infrastructure was manipulated from above. If she was going to protect the land, it wouldn't be through barricades or surveillance. It would be through light, bringing attention, scrutiny, and cold procedural challenge to every action her opponents attempted. But that would take time. And she had no illusions. Time was not something they would allow her much more of. When she returned to the cabin, she found a fresh note under the door, handwritten in smooth cursive. "Last chance to avoid an unnecessary outcome. Sign the transfer or the issue moves to the next phase." No name, no organization, just threat, veiled in civility. She burned the note in the wood stove. Then she poured herself a glass of water, sat down at her father's old desk, and opened a blank legal pad. On the first page, in large letters, she wrote, "Timeline of events." She didn't stop writing until morning. The days that followed were a slow, deliberate grind. Sydney operated with relentless focus, converting the cabin into something between a war room and a forensic archive. Every page of evidence, every photograph of the evolving perimeter, every time-stamped drone capture that Eliza's team sent her, she cataloged them all, attaching copies to the growing legal framework she was building. She documented the initial boundary violations, the false letters, the staged injunction, and the attempts at quiet coercion. She worked like a litigator preparing for a federal case, which in some ways she was. But she didn't announce what she was doing. She kept it tight, controlled, operating on the same bandwidth as those she was up against. Quiet, methodical, unflinching. Then came the silence. For nearly 4 days, there was no movement, no messages, no new flags or markers, and no vehicles parked at the edge of her access road. At first, Sydney thought perhaps the pressure campaign had lost steam, that the evidence Eliza had begun passing through state-level advisors had been enough to stall whatever bureaucratic assault had been building. But it didn't feel right. It felt like a held breath. And then, one morning, the sound of rotors snapped that stillness. A helicopter, civilian but unmarked, circled low above the property. It wasn't there for more than 3 minutes, but Sydney knew exactly what it was doing. It was surveying, scanning with cameras and likely LiDAR, mapping the terrain in high resolution. She watched from the cabin's front step as the aircraft tilted on its axis, dipping slightly toward her roofline before peeling off and vanishing into the haze over the valley. She didn't bother calling anyone. There would be no flight record accessible to the public. The message wasn't in the flight. The message was in its visibility, meant to unsettle, to remind her she was being watched from angles she couldn't counter. Later that afternoon, she noticed a new object staked beside the eastern fence, a digital sensor tower, no higher than her hip, mounted with a rotating lens and a battery pack. It was branded with the initials VIRE. No one had come to install it, at least not that she saw, but it had appeared, precise and functional, with no paper trail. Sydney removed it. She disassembled the mount, took the device apart carefully, and stored it in a metal toolbox, wrapping each piece in cloth to preserve prints. When she returned to the fence the next morning, another identical sensor had replaced it, this one embedded deeper, secured with concrete epoxy that had hardened overnight. It wasn't just monitoring now. It was a marking territory. That evening, a different kind of intrusion arrived. She was in the cabin sorting case files when the power flickered once, twice, then cut out completely. The cabin had been running on a secondary solar system augmented with a backup generator that her father had installed years ago. She went outside to check the inverter, only to find the cabling had been sliced clean. Not chewed, not frayed, but cut with a blade. The generator, too, had been tampered with. One of the fuel lines had been removed and tossed into the woods. She was being isolated, deprived of light, of heat, of means to transmit. She adjusted, quickly rerouting her power through a portable system she had installed inside a stormproof case days earlier. Her communications were still active, and she made a report to Eliza's contact at the state level, flagging the escalation and including photographic evidence. Within 24 hours, she received a call, not from Eliza but from a lawyer named Rachel Devens who specialized in land defense cases tied to resource privatization schemes. Rachel didn't offer sympathy. She offered precision. "They're not trying to scare you anymore," she said. "They're discrediting you by creating chaos. You'll be labeled unstable, obstructive, a threat to cooperative development." Sydney asked what to expect next. "They'll either try to provoke an overreaction, vandalism, confrontation, anything they can twist, or they'll isolate your utilities until you have no choice but to leave. Either way, the pressure isn't going to lessen. They don't have to win in court. They just need you to give up." The next morning, the police showed up. 2 officers from the local department. They were polite but firm, holding a printed complaint that accused Sydney of removal of public safety infrastructure and harassment of ecological surveyors. The form was filled with vague references and generic accusations. Sydney asked who filed the complaint. The younger officer hesitated, then muttered, "Community Compliance Unit." No individual name, no badge number, no signed affidavit. It was administrative noise, but noise with teeth. The officers told her they had to file a report. They didn't detain her, but they left her with a copy of the complaint and a warning. If any more devices go missing, this might move up to formal charges. It was a trap. The device had been planted specifically so she'd remove it. Now they were spinning the act of reclaiming her own land as interference. That night, Sydney stayed awake, rotating shifts between watching the tree line and scanning the airwaves with a small handheld RF monitor she had borrowed from Eliza. She caught 3 separate pulses around midnight, signals that pinged the same frequency as the sensor she had dismantled. The signals were still bouncing around her property, which meant other devices had been installed, smaller, hidden, passive, maybe even inside the cabin itself. She searched every corner and eventually found one tucked into the vent behind the fireplace. A micro-beacon, smaller than her thumb, magnetized and dust-colored. She photographed it, wrapped it in foil, and locked it away with the rest. That was when she realized they didn't want her to catch them. They wanted her to document it. They wanted her to seem obsessed, paranoid, lost in a rabbit hole, collecting objects and broadcasting claims with no hard admission of wrongdoing from the other side. Because that way, when the narrative hit a courtroom, or worse, a public hearing, they could position her as erratic, unstable, a danger to cooperative negotiation. And they were getting ready to make their move. 2 days later, a summons was posted to her door, fastened with a thumbtack like a note on a community board. It was a civil action, filed under Emergency Regional Directive 14B, requesting a temporary restraining order against her continued obstruction of cooperative infrastructure efforts. The language was technical, procedural, and lethal. The hearing was set in less than 5 days. Sydney contacted Rachel Devens immediately. Within 12 hours, Rachel had filed a motion to stay the hearing on procedural grounds, citing jurisdictional overreach, lack of notification, and the absence of agency identification in the complaint. The motion bought them 48 hours. Sydney didn't waste them. She delivered a copy of every piece of evidence to Rachel's office by secure courier, then packed a separate set in a safety deposit box under Eliza's name in the city. She began clearing the path around the cabin, not to run, but to control the visibility lines. She installed new trail markers that only she could identify. Not symbols, natural breaks, altered stone positions, clipped ferns in specific shapes. Her father had taught her that. If you can't track them, make it so they can't track you. On the 3rd night, the same black SUV returned. This time, it didn't stop on the road. It drove directly onto the edge of the clearing, lights off, engine low. Sydney stood on the porch in full view, holding her phone high, camera recording. She didn't move. The SUV stayed for 2 minutes, then reversed slowly, deliberately, and disappeared into the trees. By the time she walked back inside, she already knew this was no longer about property. This was about will. About one side trying to force silence and the other refusing to bend. And if they wanted a final push, she'd give them something to push against. Not recklessness, not violence, just immovable, patient resistance, sharpened by law, framed in fact and documented down to the inch, because there's one rule everyone forgets when they try to quietly steal something that isn't theirs. If you corner someone with nothing to lose, they won't fight for revenge. They'll fight to make sure it never happens again. The courtroom wasn't large or grand, just a rectangular space lined with wood panels that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and dust. But to Sydney, it felt like the most important battleground she had ever stood on. The hearing wasn't public, just a procedural review by a regional judge assigned to cases involving land use and compliance disputes. But the implications were massive. The opposition had filed under a title that made it sound like a simple zoning clarification request, but Rachel had parsed every sentence, flagged every concealed motive, and prepared the counterattack with the elegance and focus of someone used to war by documentation. Sydney sat beside her, silent, composed, and dressed like a professional who had nothing to prove but everything to lose. The representatives from the so-called compliance unit arrived late, dressed not in suits but in generic polos and windbreakers, giving them the look of utility contractors rather than legal personnel. Their lead spokesperson was a man Sydney recognized instantly, Michael Latham, the same one who had handed her the fake injunction and watched her cabin from the SUV. He walked in with a file folder, no briefcase, no digital equipment, and a lazy confidence that suggested he'd been here before and expected little resistance. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice trained in dispassion, began the hearing with a brief overview. Then Rachel stood. She didn't deliver a speech. She submitted a packet, 60 pages, neatly bound with appendices, maps, and affidavits. She walked the court through each one with a calm, deliberate cadence, highlighting contradictions in the complaint, inconsistencies in the jurisdictional basis, and, most importantly, the total lack of legal standing from any state-licensed agency. "This case," she said plainly, "is a coordinated private maneuver designed to create the appearance of regional authority without any legislative or governmental foundation. The goal is not regulation. The goal is acquisition." She presented the survey data, the water table overlays, the sensor logs, and the altered parcel IDs. She played audio recordings, one in which Sydney read aloud the exact wording of the so-called voluntary transfer agreement, which failed to include any named entity responsible for enforcement. When Michael was asked to respond, his tone shifted from casual to defensive. He stammered through a description of cross-jurisdictional cooperation, cited ecological sensitivity clauses that didn't exist, and, when pressed for documentation authorizing their actions, he produced a single sheet of paper without any signature. The judge narrowed her eyes. "This is a summary," she said. "Where is the statute, the ordinance, the authorizing body?" Michael offered vague references, claiming the full documentation was part of a confidential planning file. "Then submit it," the judge replied. "Now." He couldn't. Rachel didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded once as if confirming what she already knew. They had expected Sydney to fold long before this moment. They had never planned for it to reach a legal forum. The entire campaign had been built on pressure without prosecution, bluff without follow-through, a system that worked only if the target lacked either the resources or the will to push back. But Sydney had both, and now so did the court. By the end of the hour, the judge ruled the complaint invalid on every count, declared the temporary restraining order null, and issued a protective stay against further interference by any entity operating under the VR designation or any of its affiliated subsidiaries. She ordered the removal of all equipment placed on the property within 72 hours, pending review of criminal liability for unlawful surveillance and trespassing. When asked if Sydney would be seeking damages, Rachel said, "That will be addressed in a formal filing. We're not done yet." Back outside, the light felt different. Sydney stood on the courthouse steps and watched the group from Vire disperse without a word, their faces set in quiet frustration, their SUV rolling away like a piece of machinery finally breaking down. But she knew better than to celebrate. Legal victories didn't erase motivations. They just exposed them. The game hadn't ended. It had only become visible. 3 days later, crews in utility vans with unmarked plates arrived at the cabin perimeter. This time, Sydney didn't interfere. She stood with 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office who had been sent to oversee compliance with the judge's order. The crews removed every sensor, pulled out the wire, cut down the stakes, and sealed off the markers. They didn't speak. They worked in silence, heads low, as if burying evidence. Sydney noted every movement, filmed the entire process, and sent the footage to Rachel for record-keeping. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sydney returned to the cabin. She walked the full perimeter, scanning the soil for any signs of tampering. The place was quiet again, not just in sound, but in presence. The tension had lifted, the weight of being hunted replaced by the heavier but calmer responsibility of having stood her ground. She stepped inside, lit a small fire in the stove, and sat at her father's desk. On top of it, she placed the legal pad she had used to track every phase of the confrontation. She turned to the last page and wrote a single sentence. They underestimated the silence. That night, as she stood on the porch looking into the darkness, she saw movement, Not ominous, but familiar. A neighbor, an older man from 2 properties down, walked up the trail with a thermos in hand. "Heard what happened," he said. "We were waiting to see how it played out." He paused. "Now that it did, maybe it's time we all started talking again." Sidney took the coffee he offered and nodded. The war hadn't been just over land. It had been over narrative, over who got to speak, who got to own silence, who controlled the story. And now, finally, the land was quiet for the right reason, because it belonged to no one but the truth. The snow came early that year, drifting in over the mountains in slow, deliberate sheets that blanketed the valley with a silence so complete it felt sacred. For the first time in weeks, Sidney slept through the night, not because the tension had vanished, but because the tension had changed shape, become something grounded, known, a weight she now carried with steadiness instead of strain. The land was hers again, not only on paper but in the way it moved beneath her feet and in the way the wind no longer carried the static of intrusion. The cabin remained intact, weathered but defiant, just as her father had left it, and though every inch of it had been scanned, probed, threatened, and surveilled, it stood with a kind of earned dignity that no blueprint or zoning overlay could erase. The protective stay issued by the court evolved into a full injunction after Rachel filed a secondary case against the shell entity known as VAGR, with additional evidence gathered by Eliza's extended team, surveillance logs, signal recordings, internal planning documents leaked by a state archivist under whistleblower protections. They not only blocked further interference, but opened the door to criminal investigations tied to fraudulent land acquisition practices, unregistered lobbying, and unauthorized aerial scanning. Sidney watched from a distance as the mask peeled away from what had first appeared to be nothing more than a faceless zoning dispute. Behind the curtain were names, contracts, and money, so much money, all aligned for a singular purpose: to seize a future that could be sold off gallon by gallon, hidden behind terms like sustainability and regional stewardship. But none of that was her concern anymore. She had done her part, not only in defending what was hers, but in anchoring the line for others who had stood silent, waiting to see whether anyone would ever say no and make it stick. The neighbors who had once shut their doors or avoided eye contact began to reappear. Quiet visits turned into shared work, repairing a collapsed fence, stacking firewood, clearing the mountain path. There was no talk of gratitude, no dramatic declarations. Just presence. Just the return of something deeper than civility. Trust. Sidney used the winter to rebuild not just the exterior of the cabin, but the rhythm of it. She restored the tool shed, installed a permanent energy system independent from any external grid, and redrew the trail system around the perimeter, marking each bend and fork with signs that made sense only to her. She kept the old maps but annotated them with her own hand now, just as her father once had. Each note, each coordinate was a declaration, not to the county or to a court, but to herself. A reminder that control is not defined by how loudly you defend something, but by how precisely you understand it. When spring came, it brought no fanfare, only the slow thaw of soil and the return of familiar sounds, branches creaking, birds returning, water moving beneath rock. And with it came a final envelope, mailed from a law firm no longer listed online. Inside was a single-page settlement offer from a holding company with a new name, offering 3 times the appraised value of her land in exchange for a full release of claims and confidentiality. Sidney didn't even hesitate. She fed the page into the wood stove and watched it curl into black. Months later, when Rachel called to tell her that the final ruling had been posted, confirming that no future claim could be brought against her property without direct legislative approval, Sidney listened quietly, thanked her, and then walked. Outside, where the air was clean and sharp, the way it always had been before anyone tried to put it in a box. She didn't celebrate. There was no need. Some victories don't require fireworks or speeches. They require only that the land remains under your boots, unchanged by lies, untouched by threats, and known, finally and without condition, as yours.